Reprehensive Russian strike against the Dormition Cathedral was not only a stab in the back of Ukrainians, it was a slap in the face of the entire civilized world. Just imagine if Westminster Abbey in the United Kingdom had been deliberately struck by a drone. Imagine if Notre Dame de Paris had been targeted in an act of precision destruction. Imagine if St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, America's parish church, had been scared. Imagine if the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, one of the most sacred places not only for the Chinese people, but for all humanity, had been hit in the same way. Imagine if the Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark, the Riga Cathedral in Latvia, or the Parthenon and Meteora monasteries in Greece had been damaged this way. Imagine if the Badshani Mosque in Lahore, in Pakistan, one of the greatest monuments of Islamic civilization, had been attacked. Imagine if the Basilica of Santa Maria d'Antigua in Panama, if the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary of Chiquinquirá in Colombia, the Cathedral Notre Dame du Congo in Kinshasa, the Sacred Heart Cathedral in Monrovia, or the Fakhr ad-Din Mosque in Mogadishu, in Somalia, had been reduced to ruins this way. Madam President, by authorizing this deliberate drone attack of the Pechersk Lavra, Mr. Putin has secured his place among the darkest figures of modern history. His name will forever be associated not only with the destruction of cities and the killing of civilians, but also with the targeting of humanity's cultural heritage. These crimes will be remembered for generations, even long after this war has ended and justice has been served.
Europe cannot be a neutral intermediary because it is on Ukraine's side. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the same. The hypocrisy of Western leaders is evident in the fact that the EU took a decision to provide additional funding, almost 6 billion euros, which will be spent on UAVs for the Kyiv regime and the establishment of a special alliance aimed at building up UAV production. UAVs are being bought not to develop the economy, nor to rebuild infrastructure, nor to address humanitarian issues. They are being produced to kill Russian civilians and to continue military hostilities without the need to hold elections in Kyiv. Even those public opinion surveys which are controlled by Kyiv cannot hide the truth. Trust in Zelensky is close to zero, and a large portion of Ukrainian society sees its future in a change in power. Zelensky is de facto a political figure whose time in power, which has been illegal for some time now, hinges exclusively on the continuation of hostilities. President, the materials submitted by the Kyiv regime, which supposedly confirm UAV Geran hitting the Dormition Cathedral of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, are nothing but a propaganda campaign. This is a fake like many others, and it falls apart as soon as you delve into the details. Kyiv demonstrated UAV parts with a rusted engine, and this looks more like a pre-prepared prop. It doesn't look like the fragments of a UAV which supposedly had just been deployed in a strike. Witness accounts, including video materials, paint a completely different picture. The cathedral was damaged as a result of a ham-fisted attempt by a Ukrainian anti-missile defense team to intercept a Russian hypersonic Zircon missile. This was done using US Patriots, which were handed over to Kyiv by their Western backers, and they were past their use-by date. We do not strike civilian infrastructure. We meticulously uphold our obligations under the 1954 The Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict. What's more is, we couldn't have struck the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, which is a sacred place for all Orthodox Christians. We decisively reject any allegations leveled at us. What's particularly cynical is that right now, the defense of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra is being discussed by the very Ukrainian authorities who, for many years, have deliberately destroyed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They evicted and beat up clergy. They seized cathedrals and limited access thereto. That's why attempts by Zelensky to pretend to self-style themselves as defenders of Christian orthodoxy cannot be seen as anything but hypocrisy.
The 10,179th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Estonia, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Khalid Khiari, Assistant Secretary General of the Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Ms. Edem Warsornu, Director of the Crisis Response Division in the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Khalid Khiari.
President, on 15th of June, the Russian Federation launched yet another deadly strike on Ukraine. Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Sumy, and Mykolaiv regions of Ukraine were hit with dozens of missiles and hundreds of drones. In Kyiv, 5 people were reportedly killed and 30 others, including children, injured. Sites with immeasurable historic and cultural value for Ukraine and beyond were damaged. The Kyiv-Peshchersk Lavra, part of UNESCO World Heritage, was hit, causing significant damage to the exterior and interior of the 11th century Dormition Cathedral. This religious complex is one of Ukraine's most significant landmarks. Its exceptional universal value reflects the spiritual and cultural development of the region. Since February 2022, UNESCO has verified damage to more than 530 cultural sites across the country. Madam President, that same night, in Ukraine's second-largest city, Kharkiv, 5 emergency workers were reportedly killed in a so-called double-tap attack. The evening before, the Kharkiv Art Museum was struck by a drone. A 1-month-old baby and 4 other people were reportedly injured in this strike. Attacks have continued daily. Just yesterday evening, a missile strike reportedly killed 1 person and injured 3 others in Odessa. On 19th of June, in the port of Odessa, foreign civilian vessels were hit by drones, reportedly killing 1 crew member and injuring 2 others. Madam President, these escalating aerial attacks have increased the civilian death toll. According to the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, last month at least 274 civilians were killed and 1,763 injured in Ukraine. This is the highest monthly combined figure of killed and injured since April 2022. In total, since the start of the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, OHCHR has verified that at least 16,126 civilians, including 796 children, have been killed in Ukraine. 46,590 civilians, including 2,835 children, have been injured. Actual figures are likely higher. Madam President, we remain concerned about the impact of the war on civilians in territories of Ukraine under the temporary occupation of the Russian Federation, including in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol. We are also concerned about the growing impact of the war on civilians in the Russian Federation. Just today, 3 people were reportedly injured in a missile strike on a manufacturing plant in the city of Voronezh. On 18th of June, 17 people, including children, were reportedly injured in an Ukrainian drone strike, the largest such strike targeting Moscow and surrounding areas since the start of the war. Drones reportedly hit a major oil processing facility, also causing damage to residential buildings and large commercial centers. The attacks continued the following day. On 17th of June, a drone strike reportedly hit a bus carrying a Belarusian youth soccer team in the Bryansk region of the Russian Federation. According to Russian and Belarusian authorities, 1 pregnant woman was reportedly killed and 7 people, 5 of them children, injured. On 15th of June, Russian officials reported that 3 people were killed and 3 others injured, including a 1-year-old child, following a reported Ukrainian drone attack in Tula region. According to Russian authorities, in the first 5 months of this year, 184 civilians were killed and 1,175 injured in several regions of the Russian Federation. Madam President, international humanitarian law is clear. Attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructure, including cultural sites, are strictly prohibited. They must stop now, wherever they occur. We reiterate our firm condemnation of all such attacks. Madam President, the increased military activity reported near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in recent weeks remain a grave concern. The International Atomic Energy Agency maintains its presence at all of Ukraine's nuclear sites, including Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, to help ensure nuclear safety and security. We reiterate the imperative for all parties to act responsibly and exercise maximum restraint by immediately ceasing military activities near all nuclear facilities, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Madam President, later this week, the annual Ukraine Recovery Conference will take place in Gdansk, Poland, seeking to advance international efforts in support of Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. The United Nations will continue to support the people of Ukraine in their long road to recovery. We stress the importance of the participation of women in recovery efforts and in decision-making impacting the future of their country. At the same time, recovery will only be sustainable if it is anchored in a broader vision for peace. Madam President, if the current dangerous cycle of escalation continues, we will undoubtedly witness further devastation in Ukraine, as well as increasingly in the Russian Federation. Worsening instability across the region will only further complicate an already perilous path to peace. Concerted diplomatic efforts toward the full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire must resume now. We continue to call for immediate de-escalation to enable meaningful, inclusive negotiations for a just, lasting and comprehensive peace in Ukraine, in line with the United Nations Charter, international law and relevant UN resolutions. The United Nations supports all efforts to that end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. And I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Edem Wosornu.
Madam President, Building on the briefing from my colleague ASG Chiari from DPPA, let me turn to the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Since we last briefed this Council 2 weeks ago, civilian harm and suffering have deepened, including over this past weekend. More families have been forced to endure the all too familiar pattern of this war: attacks, destruction, loss, another night without safety. On June 15, strikes on Kyiv and Kharkiv damaged homes and critical infrastructure, leaving well over 100,000 households without power. Again, as mentioned by ASG Chiari, in Kyiv, the Kyiv Pesherek Lavra Monastery, a UNESCO World Heritage Site at the heart of Ukraine's religious and cultural life, was struck and damaged. This site carries centuries of cultural heritage, history, identity that must be protected. In Kharkiv, rescuers responding to an earlier strike were themselves hit when a second one followed. This fits a documented pattern. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has found repeated strikes on ambulances, rescue teams, and aid workers, in some cases, as you heard, hit twice as they returned to help. Civilians have also been struck when simply going about their daily life, in their cars, on buses, in their gardens. The monitoring mission records that more civilians were killed and injured by short-range drones in May than in any month since February 2022. Technological advances in warfare, including drones, are expanding the zone of danger for civilians, which is no longer confined by the reach of artillery. Cheap first-person view drones are causing widespread civilian harm along the front lines. They are equipped with cameras that let the operators see exactly what they are striking. Madam President, we are also concerned by reports of harm to civilians, damage to infrastructure, and associated environmental risks in the Russian Federation, now extending to Moscow itself. The absence of a United Nations monitoring presence does not diminish the seriousness of these reports. Let me reiterate that international humanitarian law binds all parties to this conflict equally, wherever they carry out military operations. This includes an unequivocal obligation to comply with the rules of distinction, proportionality, and precautions throughout this conflict. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, humanitarian partners supported first responders in Kyiv and Kharkiv after the strikes of June 15 with emergency repairs and psychosocial support. Response has continued across multiple regions following subsequent attacks. We continue to support voluntary civilian evacuations and bring assistance to frontline communities in need wherever access allows. But that space is narrowing. Evacuation teams report being tracked and followed by first-person view drones as they try to reach people near the front line, putting civilians aiming to leave the front line, as well as humanitarians at risk of harm. Every attack on an ambulance, every attack on an aid convoy deprives anyone who would otherwise have been helped. It also affects the very people who are trying to assist: humanitarian personnel, health workers. Madam President, my two asks are not new. They are even more urgent given what we continue to see. First, and again, use your influence to ensure all parties comply with international humanitarian law wherever they take the fight. This means ensuring the protection of civilians and civilian objects, including critical infrastructure and cultural property everywhere. Civilians wanting to evacuate frontline areas must also be allowed to do so in a safe and in a dignified manner, and humanitarian workers must be protected as they carry out their mission. It also means pressing for safe, rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access to civilians in need. Second, provide timely, flexible funding. Without it, the consequences fall on the most vulnerable and least able to move out of harm's way. These resources allow humanitarians to stay and deliver, even as the operating environment becomes more dangerous. For millions of people suffering through these hostilities, what this council does matters greatly. The choices made here can mean the difference between civilians protected, it can make the difference between civilians harmed, and it can make the difference between civilians killed. The choices we made here can mean the difference between aid delivered or aid denied. And the choices made here can mean lives saved or lives lost. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wozorno for her briefing. I will now give the floor to those members of the Council wishing to make a statement. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Assistant Secretary General Khaled Chiari and the OCHA Director Adam Wozorno for their factual briefings. Latvia strongly condemns the massive Russian missile and drone assaults against Ukrainian civilians, including on June 14th and 15th. The strikes killed at least 11 civilians across Ukraine and injured several dozens. In Kharkiv, at least 5 first responders were killed in a double-tap strikes. On the same night, the Russian armed forces bombed one of the oldest and most sacred monasteries and religious sites of the Orthodox world using Russian drone Geran-2. Kyiv-Pечерsk-Lavra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was established in the 11th century in Kyiv, the vibrant capital of the ancient Kievan Rus. Madam President, this is incomprehensible. How could Kyiv-Pечерsk-Lavra be deliberately bombed by Russia, a country which associates itself with Orthodox Christianity and talks so often about protection of traditional moral norms? The attack on Kyiv-Pечерsk-Lavra might have something to do with the fact that this monastery is an iconic site of Orthodox Christianity, and that it is, in fact, older than Moscow, which was first mentioned in historical chronicles almost 100 years later as a minor, remote hunting outpost. For centuries, Russia has tried and failed to gain control over Ukraine's Orthodox Church. It failed through the infiltration of priests. It failed through corruption. It also failed through lawfare and disinformation. Finally, it is resorting to bombing, attempting to destroy Orthodox religious sites. These too will fail. These sites will be restored. Russia is attempting to undermine the very foundations of Ukrainian identity and culture in a futile attempt to subjugate Ukraine and impose an alternative understanding of history. Russia wants to erase the rich history of the Ukrainian nation. On 24th of May, Russia destroyed the Chernobyl Museum in Kyiv. And 2 months earlier, on 24th of March, it attacked another UNESCO World Heritage Site, Lviv's historic center, damaging the Bernardine Monastery. 2 years ago, on 23rd of May 2024, Russia attacked Ukraine's main printing house in Kharkiv, killing 7 people and destroying thousands of books in the Ukrainian language. It is a pattern. UNESCO has verified damage to 536 cultural sites, including 154 religious sites, 41 museums, and 22 libraries. International humanitarian law is clear. The deliberate destruction of cultural heritage in wartime constitutes a war crime and may amount to crimes against humanity. It is a pattern of targeted, barbaric, and widespread attacks that violate the most basic rules of international humanitarian law, namely the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Madam President, in the occupied territories of Ukraine, the lack of fundamental freedoms and the scale of atrocities are unthinkable. Ukrainian language is banned in schools. Ukrainian literature and symbols are confiscated or destroyed. Statues of Ukrainian poets have been removed. Children are under constant Russification and militarization. Civilians are arbitrarily detained, even for wearing blue and yellow, the colors of the flag of Ukraine. All Christian denominations, other than Kremlin-linked Russian Orthodox Church, face various degrees of restrictive measures and oppression. The indigenous Muslim community of Crimean Tatars is targeted through bogus counter-extremism and anti-terrorism charges. Such dismantling of fundamental freedoms is again a textbook example of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. All of these crimes must not go unpunished. Accountability must prevail over impunity. If Russia wants to argue otherwise regarding the situation in the occupied territories and its detention facilities, it is free to prove everyone wrong by granting unimpeded access to the occupied territories and detention facilities for independent monitors and UN agencies, especially OHCHR. Let the facts speak for themselves. Madam President, Ukraine is standing strong. Latvia continues to stand with Ukraine. With no victories to report from the front, Russia has intensified its targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Russia is the sole aggressor, bearing exclusive responsibility for the illegal invasion and executing a deliberate campaign of atrocities against innocent civilians on their sovereign soil. Enough is enough. The time for a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire is now. A ceasefire is not merely a so-called Western position, as Russia likes to frame it. All but one member of this Council has called for a ceasefire. It is time for Russia to act on it. I thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank you for your statement, sir. Thank you, Latvia. And I now give the floor to Denmark.
President. I thank ASG Chiari and Director Vosono for their briefings. Yet again, the Security Council has convened to urgently address the humanitarian suffering caused by renewed large-scale Russian attacks on Ukraine. Another mass casualty attack came in the night of the 14th and 15th of June. Hundreds of Russian drones and missiles hit urban areas across Ukraine, including Kyiv, Dnipro, and Kharkiv. They killed at least 11 civilians and injured 53. Denmark condemns these deadly strikes on civilians in the strongest possible terms and extends our deep condolences to these latest victims of Russia's senseless war. These attacks also resulted in significant damage to major cultural landmarks, including the Kharkiv Art Museum and the UNESCO World Heritage Monastery in Kyiv, one of the most sacred places in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This follows Russian strikes in May on the Kyiv Small Opera, the Dynamo Stadium, the National Art Museum, the Ukrainian House, and the Institute of Literature. With these attacks, precious lives are lost, people are injured, and irreplaceable historical and cultural landmarks are destroyed. International humanitarian law provides special protection to cultural and religious sites, because these sites bear meaning, they bear history. Attacks on cultural landmarks deprive communities of shared heritage and identity. Denmark calls for IHL to be fully respected without exception and demands full accountability and justice for all the crimes committed in Russia's war of choice. Madam President, more than 60,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or injured in this war. A horrifying statistics. Behind each number is a heartbreaking story of a life cut short or left with life-altering trauma, and countless family members are left to grieve. Enough is enough. Russia is trying to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign and independent state, to erase its memory, its history, its identity. But well into this fifth year since the full-scale invasion, this war has failed to achieve any of its goals. Madam President, the international community must increase the pressure on Russia to halt its senseless war. Russia's leaders are the only ones who can end the fighting, and they can do so today if they choose. Ukraine has been offering an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire for well over a year. It's obvious that the only answer is a permanent ceasefire to allow for serious negotiations aimed at a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. Denmark and our partners reaffirm our steadfast support for Ukraine as it defends itself from Russia's aggressions. I thank you.
Gracias por.
I thank Denmark for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France. Thank you, President. I would like to thank Mr. Khaled Hiari, Assistant Secretary General of the Department of Political Affairs, as well as the Director of OCHA, Ms. Eren Wosornu, for their statements. This Council is meeting today after Russian strikes on the 14th and 15th of June against Ukraine. These massive strikes are happening unambiguously in a context of Russian escalation against Ukrainian lives, an escalation that is unfortunately officially celebrated by Moscow since the end of May. In the capital, at least 5 people were killed and tens of others were injured, including children. France fully joins the Ukrainian people in solidarity, and we mourn these deaths. So once again, the cultural heritage of Ukraine has been attacked. The Dormition Cathedral, the Arsenal Museum, and the rich cultural heritage, as well as the art museum in Kyiv. President, these damages, like the strikes, are unacceptable. The Peshchersk Lavra Monastery, which is part of UNESCO's World Heritage List, is one of the most sacred sites of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, as well as a symbol of Ukrainian's capital. France recalls that destructing Ukrainian's cultural heritage is a violation of the 1972 Convention on the Global Cultural Heritage of UNESCO. It also recalls that protecting cultural sites during a war is not just a moral duty, it is an obligation enshrined in IHL, which is part of the Hague Convention of 1954, which imposes upon all warring parties the obligation to preserve the cultural heritage of humanity. The President of the French Republic has made France available in order to work with Ukrainian authorities that are in charge of preserving this cultural heritage. President, the edifying images of this historic site show us that once again enough is enough. We need to reach a ceasefire. The Secretary General of the United Nations, supported by the vast majority of member states of this council, has asked for this clearly: an immediate ceasefire, a full and unconditional ceasefire. Now, the leaders of France, Germany, and the UK that met in London on the 7th of June with the Ukrainian president said it once again, as they affirmed their will to negotiate immediately and seriously with Russia to put an end to the war and reach a lasting and just peace. President, Russia has to hear us. They have to hear our calls for de-escalation, for the fighting to stop and to seriously negotiate. Because there is no military solution to this war that they started more than 4 years ago now. Ukraine is defending itself and is responding to an aggression as it is enshrined in Article 51 of the Charter. They have the right to this without any kind of territorial claim to Russia. We support the resistance. That support is unshakable. In Evian, the leaders of the G7, the United States, Canada, Japan, and European leaders showed their unity in their support for Ukraine, that is defending its liberty, its sovereignty, and territorial integrity. They committed to broadening their support for Ukraine and increasing pressure on Russia so that they go back on this choice of a war of aggression and to make them commit in good faith to peace negotiations. President, after the wasted opportunities of these months for temporary ceasefires, Russia has to choose peace. Ukraine is ready for it. France and its partners are ready for it. I thank you. I would like to thank the representative of France, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to begin by thanking you for convening this meeting and Assistant Secretary General Kyiv and Director Wosornou for their remarks. Madam President, Russia's aggression against Ukraine continues unabated into its 5th year. Early last Monday, Russia launched 600 Shahed drones and 70 missiles of various types against peaceful neighborhoods in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Dnipro, causing yet another heavy toll of casualties among innocent civilians. At least 11 died and over 100 were injured following a preceding weekend in which 18 people had lost their lives and 150 had been wounded. As the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has reported, May was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since the start of the full-scale invasion, almost doubling casualties from May 2025. Most casualties occur in urban centers far removed from the front line. In that respect, we deplore Russia's use of increasingly more lethal weapons, missiles and drones in civilian areas. We equally deplore the targeting of first responders through so-called double-tap strikes. Once again, we condemn these and any attacks against civilians and civilian objects wherever they may occur. We call for full respect of international humanitarian and human rights law and stress that accountability remains a foundation of any durable peace. Madam President, as was the case in the previous wave of attacks at the end of May, Russian strikes have again struck some of Ukraine's most prominent cultural landmarks and heritage sites. This time, the violence damaged the very core of Ukrainian religious sentiment, the historic Domitian Cathedral, the great church within the sacred Perchesk Lavra Orthodox Monastery complex, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that had only been targeted only twice during its 1,000-year history. According to UNESCO, over 536 cultural sites have been damaged in Ukraine since the start of Russia's aggression, affecting both the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of the Ukrainian people. Greece, as a staunch defender of cultural identity, a vital strategic necessity for survival and national resilience, joins UNESCO in condemning the attack against Kyiv Perchesk Lavra and any attacks against cultural property and educational institutions. We underline that deliberate attacks on protected cultural heritage sites constitute war crimes and may amount to crimes against humanity. The same applies for violations against the children of Ukraine, including the deportation and forcible transfer. In that respect, we note with grave concern that the Russian armed forces have been listed for the fourth consecutive year in the annexes of the annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict, listed as perpetrators of violations against children. We call on Russia to cooperate fully with the relevant UN institutions. Madam President, it is evident that this protracted war must end. A negotiated settlement leading to a just and lasting peace based on international law, the UN Charter, and the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states is the only way forward. In this regard, we would continue to support any US-led initiatives aimed at ending the war. Lastly, we reaffirm once again that no peace in Ukraine can be agreed without Ukraine and that Europe must be actively involved in any future arrangements on robust security guarantees and in a final peace agreement that will foreclose the recurrence of war and ensures a sovereign, independent, and democratic future for Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. And thank you, ASG Kyiari and Director Wasornu, for your briefing today. The United Kingdom strongly condemns Russia's latest mass strikes against Ukrainian cities, including the large-scale attack of 14-15 June, which killed at least 11 civilians. That night, Russia launched 611 drones and 70 missiles against Ukraine, yet another escalation. This included 40 ballistic and hypersonic missiles, making it the second largest such attack of this war, surpassed only by the 41 launched earlier this month. These intensifying attacks have driven a sharp rise in civilian casualties. In May, OCHA recorded the highest monthly total since the beginning of the war. Casualty figures for June are on course to be even higher. At this Council's most recent meeting on Ukraine, I heard almost all colleagues express concern at this trajectory and the impact on civilians. But Russia again rejected allegations of civilian harm and accused others of selective outrage. As well as killing Ukrainian civilians on 14 June, Russian drones and missiles also damaged cultural heritage and identity, setting ablaze the Kyiv-Pechersk-Lavra, a site of profound religious and cultural significance, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Under international humanitarian law, Russia is obligated to protect such sites. Russia has already sought to deflect responsibility, part of a familiar pattern of destruction, then denial, then disinformation. It is hard not to view such attacks as an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity and culture. That night, the Mistetsky Arsenal Arts Museum and the Alexandra Dovzhenko National Film Studio were also hit. And since 2022, UNESCO has verified damage to over 500 religious sites in Ukraine, 200 buildings of historic interest, as well as museums, monuments, theatres, and libraries. This includes the devastating destruction of Odessa Cathedral in July 2023. And yet Russia claims to protect religious communities. Colleagues, hollow claims are a part of Russia's modus operandi. Despite its claims to have initiated the invasion to keep populations safe, one need look no further than the multiple reports of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine to see what Russia deems safe. Reports of systematic torture of prisoners of war, deportation and forced transfer of children, attacks resulting in significant damage to schools and to hospitals. These actions speak for themselves. President, the international community has been loud and clear in calling for a ceasefire. Enough is enough. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK for the statement, and I now give the floor to the Kingdom of Bahrain. Madam President, at the beginning of his statement, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Europe, the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific, Mr. Khalid Khiari, as well as Ms. Edem Wosornu, the Director of the Crisis Response Division in the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, for their briefings that were very well founded. I would like to also welcome different participants to this meeting. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain followed with deep concern the evolution of the Russo-Ukrainian war, including damages caused to civilian infrastructure of a vital nature, as well as residential buildings and energy infrastructure, as well as cultural and heritage sites, and the threats for the lives and safety of civilians. We are meeting today for the 6th time in 1 month, which is a reflection of the gravity of the situation and the fundamental need for an immediate de-escalation to return to the negotiating table by prioritizing diplomatic solutions rather than military solutions. President, civilians in Russia and Ukraine bear a burden for this war that is continuing, and they face growing humanitarian pressures. According to the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, in May of this year, we saw the highest number of civilian victims of the conflict over 4 years. In this context, we would like to insist on the need of avoiding civilian targets and ensuring the protection of civilians and humanitarian personnel by redoubling our international efforts in order to minimize the number of violations and to protect lives as well as civilian sites. We call for a total respect of the provisions of international law, IHL, and we also call for strengthened international efforts in order to reach a global, just, and lasting peace. President, we reiterate our concern vis-à-vis the growing use of drones in armed conflicts, and especially between neighboring countries. This has serious consequences and causes the loss of human life as well as large-scale losses when it comes to vital infrastructures. We are acutely aware of the seriousness of these threats because we were targeted by drone attacks in our territory. Therefore, we insist on the need to respect the provisions of international law, of international humanitarian law, and to avoid targeting vital civilian infrastructures. Continuing with these attacks undermines diplomatic and humanitarian efforts in order to find a peaceful and lasting solution for this conflict. Moreover, we reiterate our support to all regional and international initiatives to put an end to this war through dialogue and peaceful means in order to lessen human suffering, while we also strengthen stability and security at the international and regional level in order to reestablish a just and lasting peace. We also reaffirm the importance of continuing with diplomatic efforts and revitalizing negotiations between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This includes efforts deployed by the United States of America. Both parties must show the necessary political will in order to solve this crisis sustainably, while they also take into account the legitimate security concerns of all parties and by enhancing peace and stability in Europe. In order to conclude, Madam President, we would like to reiterate our deep conviction on the need to respect the principles of international law and the UN Charter, in order to strengthen a culture for peace, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence amongst peoples, as well as regional and international efforts in order to find a lasting global political solution in order to put an end to this war. I thank you, President. I would like to thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель.
Madam President, the permanent mission of Ukraine and our European colleagues are trying to keep the Ukrainian dossier afloat at the Security Council by any means. The object of these pronouncements, all for show, are to once again accuse Russia of all ills and to hoodwink an international audience right now. Yet we should remind you that the situation before us has its causes. First, starting in 2014, the Russophone population of Ukraine has systematically been subjected to persecution and genocide. The decision to defend them could not be postponed any longer. Second, Western states' actions aimed at establishing an inhumane anti-Russian regime in Kyiv raised the threat level to our country to unacceptable levels. This is important to remember today, on a day when we remember the 85th anniversary of fascist Germany attacking the USSR. On this day, all of Russia stops to observe a minute of silence. It comes as no surprise that all sorts of problems are coming out of the woodwork. The German newspaper Spiegel came out with a cover page talking about war against Russia. Leading politicians in Berlin are talking about preparations for war with our country. There's a scandal between Kyiv and Warsaw regarding the celebration and reburial with state honors of Nazi acolytes, whose hands are stained with the blood of hundreds of thousands of Russians, Poles, and Jews. And yet, over all these years, the beacons of democracy said in this very chamber that Russia is wrong, that Russia is lying, and that they need to support the Kiev regime so as to protect Europe's future from bloodthirsty Russia. In light of the above, I cannot but cite this example. That is the meeting requested by Russia in 2022 about the US support to a military biological program in Ukraine, something that was categorically and systematically denied. Back then, the PR at the time, Barbara Woodward, the PR of the UK, said, and I quote, Russia submitted to the Council groundless and irresponsible theories, conspiracy theories, absolute nonsense. And the French permanent representative said Russia won't fool anyone with its lies. And yet, just a few days ago, a high-ranking US representative confirmed and disclosed documents attesting to the fact that these programs did exist. It's important to recall that General Igor Kirillov, who worked on this file, was killed on the 17th of December 2024 as a result of a terrorist attack. Colleagues, think back to this every time when Ukrainian or Western representatives say that there weren't any threats to Russia, or when they say that all Russia brings to the Security Council are fakes. Today, the EU is not even trying to hide the fact that it's a party to the conflict. It's bearing the brunt of the financial support and the military and technological supplies going to the Zelensky regime. Kaja Kallas said outright, Europe cannot be a neutral intermediary because it is on Ukraine's side. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the same. The hypocrisy of Western leaders is evident in the fact that the EU took a decision to provide additional funding, almost 6 billion euros, which will be spent on UAVs for the Kiev regime and the establishment of a special alliance aimed at building up UAV production. UAVs are being bought not to develop the economy, nor to rebuild infrastructure, nor to address humanitarian issues. They are being produced to kill Russian civilians and to continue military hostilities. I turn to the European members serving on the Council. After all that, you think you have the moral right to speak of peace? You think you can vie for the role of intermediary in the settlement of this conflict? Against this backdrop, statements made by Western leaders following the G7 summit in France, pronouncements to the tune that they're committed to peace and diplomacy, these are empty words. The summit communique is all about war. It details the measures aimed at further growing military support to Kyiv, growing deliveries of anti-missile defense, long-range UAVs and missiles, the build-up of military manufacturing on Ukrainian territory, and the growing of sanctions pressure on Russia. The main goal is clear. It has been for a while. The goal is not to achieve peace. It's to drag out the conflict to the last Ukrainian, so as to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. The result, thanks to the efforts of the collective West, Ukraine has been transformed into a testing ground for testing UAVs and Western weapons, a hub for mercenaries and international terrorist foreign terrorist fighters. It's also a narcotic drugs hub and a giant laboratory for studying various kinds of pathogens. Supported by its Western patrons and sponsors, the Zelensky regime crossed the line past which human lives are simply expendable long ago. They crossed this line in the fight for external funding. In an attempt to cling to power by any means, Zelensky has waged terror against civilians. Massacres in cold blood waged on civilians are now the calling card of Ukrainian militia, who are repeating the atrocities of World War II era killing squads, Nazi Germany killing squads. In the week between the 8th and 14th of June, due to Ukrainian armed forces UAF actions, 254 casualties were reported in Russia. 225 were injured, including 12 children and teenagers. 29 people died, including one child. Constant strikes are reported on passenger trains, intercity buses, city buses, everything that is inextricably linked to the daily lives of ordinary citizens. In total, Ukrainian armed units launched at least 4,976 munitions on Russian civilian objects. There is no military necessity for such strikes, nor can there be. This is genuine terror against civilians, the goal being to instill fear, panic, and also to achieve bloody PR dividends for an external audience. Alongside these crimes, the UAF tried to destroy a World Cultural Heritage site in Sevastopol, the Defense of Sevastopol Museum. Thus, they showed outright contempt for the norms of international law. Further evidence of the moral decay of the Kyiv regime is a Ukrainian UAV strike on a bus in the Bryansk region, which contained passengers, children from sporting schools in Belarus going to vacation in Gelendzhik. As a result of this vile crime, a woman accompanying the children, who was pregnant, died. She had been born in Lugansk. She is succeeded by 2 daughters. 8 more people, including 6 children, were injured. By all accounts, this crime is aimed at provoking Minsk. In other words, pulling Minsk into the conflict. Madam President, what deserves our attention is the propaganda campaign the Ukrainians are waging, a campaign of strikes on Russian energy and power sector sites. In Kyiv and a number of Western capitals, as far as we can tell, they'd expected for these attacks to result in large-scale disruption of this particular sector in Russia, thereby dealing a blow to the economy, prompting social discontent, and thereby affecting the course of the hostilities. But their hopes were in vain. Despite some damage, the Russian fuel and energy system continues to function. It is, in fact, functioning according to the principle of business as usual. Kyiv didn't manage to extract any strategic benefits, nor did it alter the situation on the front, nor did it undermine public stability. Against this backdrop, Zelensky has stooped to outright primitive pronouncements about the domestic political situation in Russia, seeking consolation in fantasies about supposed reductions in the trust to the Russian leadership. He should pay greater attention to sentiments, public sentiments in his own country. Also, his so-called democratic sponsors should at last remember about the need to hold elections in Kyiv. Even those public opinion surveys which are controlled by Kyiv cannot hide the truth. Trust in Zelensky is close to zero, and a large portion of Ukrainian society sees its future in a change in power. Zelensky is de facto a political figure whose time in power, which has been illegal for some time now, hinges exclusively on the continuation of hostilities. Against this backdrop, his gloating pronouncements about Russia look like a pathetic attempt to distract everyone's attention from his own political bankruptcy. Madam President, the special military operation is consistently achieving its objectives. The Russian armed forces still hold the strategic initiative across the entire military contact line. They're inflicting significant losses on the enemy, both in terms of personnel and equipment. They are continuing to liberate territories. Despite the unprecedented military and financial support Kyiv is receiving from the West, attempts to change the situation on the battlefield to the advantage of the Ukrainian armed forces have not been successful. Between the 14th and 15th of June, in response to terrorist attacks committed by the Kiev regime, the Russian armed forces conducted massive high-precision, long-range weapon strikes and also deployed strike drones, hitting military-industrial complex sites in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk. Enterprises involved in developing, producing, maintaining, and preparing for use UAVs, radio location systems, payloads for UAVs and missiles, boosters for cruise missiles, Flamingo cruise missiles, aviation engines, and other parts. Strikes were also waged on airfields in Vasilkov, Uman, Cherkasy, and Krasnaya Slobodka, in addition to other sites in Kyiv. Thus, solely military and military-industrial sites were struck, those directly involved in bolstering the military capabilities of the UAF. Now, the Western media won't tell you what I just said. However, Russian forces continue to advance. The operation aimed at eliminating UAF units in Konstantinovka. In Kramatorsk, Drushkovka, and Slavensk, the enemy is hastily evacuating enterprises and occupation offices. The defense of Rai Alexandrovka has fallen once and for all, and this was one of the strongest fortified districts to the east of Slavensk. Events in the north of Sumy and Kharkov regions and around Dobropolsk are also not to the advantage of the enemy. We've seen progress with the storming of Krasny Liman. The UAF is regularly losing territory and settlements. President, the materials submitted by the Kiev regime, which supposedly confirm UAV Geran hitting the Domitian Cathedral of the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra, are nothing but a propaganda campaign. This is a fake like many others, and it falls apart as soon as you delve into the details. Kiev demonstrated UAV parts with a rusted engine, and this looks more like a pre-prepared prop. It doesn't look like the fragments of a UAV which supposedly had just been deployed in a strike. Witness accounts, including video materials, paint a completely different picture. The cathedral was damaged as a result of a ham-fisted attempt by a Ukrainian anti-missile defense team to intercept a Russian hypersonic Zircon missile. This was done using US Patriots, which were handed over to Kiev by their Western backers, and they were past their use-by date. We do not strike civilian infrastructure. We meticulously uphold our obligations under the 1954 The Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict. What's more is, we couldn't have struck the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra, which is a sacred place for all Orthodox Christians. We decisively reject any allegations leveled at us. What's particularly cynical is that right now, the defense of the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra is being discussed by the very Ukrainian authorities who, for many years, have deliberately destroyed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They evicted and beat up clergy. They seized cathedrals and limited access thereto. That's why attempts by Zelensky to pretend to self-style themselves as defenders of Christian orthodoxy cannot be seen as anything but hypocrisy and something completely absurd. Colleagues said that the Ukrainian language is being persecuted in Russia. The Russian-speaking population in Ukraine is roughly 80%. However, there the use of Russian is banned in the legislation. A few days ago, Zelensky signed into law further measures to this effect. This is a clear-cut, flagrant violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter, in addition to a violation of the Constitution of Ukraine. Madam President, The Russian Federation will continue to unswervingly pursue the objectives of the special military operation. Neither deliveries of Western weapons, nor sanctions, nor attempts to exert pressure can change the situation on the front. The objectives of the special military operation will be achieved in full, and all sources of threats to Russia's security will be eliminated. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Russia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, ASG Chiari and Director Wosornu for your briefings today. The United States supports Ukraine in defending its freedom and sovereignty. The United States stands with the Ukrainian population suffering from attacks damaging their critical infrastructure and cultural heritage, including Russia's strike against Kyiv, Pechersk, Lavra. Russia's attacks on June 14-15 reportedly killed at least 5 emergency workers. As President Trump made clear during the G7 summit last week, Russia should make a deal. Time is not on Moscow's side. Russia is taking 40,000 casualties per month. Its economy is severely strained. Ukraine is innovating quickly. Diplomacy and negotiation, not more bloodshed, are the only answer. Nothing else will stop this senseless killing. This war has gone on for far too long, and it must end. The United States is committed to reaching a ceasefire and negotiated settlement to end the Russia-Ukraine war as soon as possible. Enough is enough. It is time for an immediate ceasefire. Now is the time for Russia and Ukraine to return to the negotiation table and get a peace deal done. Thank you.
I thank the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Madam President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to thank the Republic of Colombia for convening this meeting. My delegation commends the presence of the ASG, Mr. Khaled Kari, as well as that of Director Edem Wosornu, Crisis Response Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. Thank you for your exhaustive briefings at the outset of this debate. Madam President, once again, my delegation would like to express its deep disquiet about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The ongoing deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation is particularly alarming, especially given the growing repercussions it's having on civilians. Information that's regularly been provided to the Council over the last week is not reassuring. On the contrary, it confirms concerning intensification in hostilities and ever more serious consequences on the humanitarian front, meaning that the prospects of a peaceful settlement, which we very much hope for and have called for, are further and further away. Madam President, what's particularly concerning and also paradoxical is the following. Military technology has never been so sophisticated, and yet their effects on civilians are extremely serious. Concerningly so, exponential losses is what we're seeing without any prospects of these losses relenting. This is something that's permeated the dynamics of this conflict. This paradox is reflected in various reports which recall, and strikingly so, that no technological advance can spare civilians from the suffering which ongoing war will result in. Further intensification of hostilities using UAVs and long-range weapons goes hand in hand with ever more grave repercussions for civilians, essential infrastructure, essential for the survival of said civilians, as well as cultural and religious heritage, the safeguarding of which is an obligation under international law. Madam President, we cannot repeat it enough. There cannot be a military solution to this conflict. Solely a political and diplomatic settlement, underpinned by dialogue, good faith, and respect for the principles of the UN Charter, will help us pave the way towards a credible prospect of peace. Against this backdrop, my delegation believes that an effective, verifiable ceasefire that is implemented in good faith, that this is what is an indispensable precondition for a credible resumption of dialogue. To this end, we urge all parties to exercise the greatest restraint and encourage all initiatives aimed at bolstering the protection of civilians, preserving basic infrastructure, and promoting effective de-escalation. A genuine cessation of hostilities would allow us not only to alleviate the suffering of civilians, but also to progressively restore the confidence measures which are necessary for any serious negotiations to gain momentum. Recent diplomatic overtures show that despite ongoing persistent difficulties, the path of dialogue remains open, and it deserves our fully fledged support. We stand resolutely alongside civilians affected by this conflict. Thus, the Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to recall the obligation to meticulously respect international law as well as international humanitarian law, something that all states parties are duty-bound to do. We reiterate on this opportunity our commitment to respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of all states, something that is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. In a similar vein, my delegation would like to recall that the parties to the conflict are duty-bound to distinguish under all circumstances between military objectives and civilians as well as civilian objects. Madam President, by way of conclusion, the Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to encourage all diplomatic efforts which seek to create the conditions for a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace underpinned by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We also call on the international community to step up its humanitarian support for the affected populations without any distinction and in full respect for the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Last but not least, my delegation urges the Security Council to fully shoulder its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. At every new meeting on Ukraine, the same reality is brought before us. The war is making civilians pay a very heavy price. This reality should spur us into action, action which could help us to safeguard human lives, respect for international law, and the conditions for a lasting political settlement. I thank you. I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Cycles of attack continue to aggravate the long-drawn conflict in Ukraine. The escalation and the expansion of the battlefield have further compounded the humanitarian situation, piling on the agony for the civilian population and related infrastructure. Repeated calls by the international community for protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure and respect for IHL remain unheeded. We once again underscore the need for the parties to abide by their obligation under international law, including international humanitarian law, without any exception. President, there is an urgent need to reverse this perilous momentum. Primary responsibility for this rests with the parties. We firmly believe that for sustainable peace to return to the region, primacy must be given to dialogue and diplomacy, eschewing the quest for military ascendancy. It is imperative to build trust between the parties and create necessary conditions conducive for the revival of the dialogue process. we reiterate our call for an immediate and complete cessation of hostilities and the resumption of the United States facilitated dialogue process. Mutually acceptable peaceful settlement, consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and corresponding to the legitimate security interests of all sides and the relevant multilateral agreements, is the only viable path to lasting peace. Pakistan will continue to support all efforts aimed at achieving a just, comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama. Thank you very much, Madam President. We would like to thank Mr. Khalid Khiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Europe, America, Asia, and the Pacific, and Ms. Edem Bosornu, Director of the Crisis and Response Division in OCHA, for sharing detailed information on recent events related to the conflict in Ukraine. We would like to recognize the participation of different delegations that have joined us today. The Security Council is meeting once again to address the situation in Ukraine. Since Panama assumed its mandate as an elected member of this council in 2025, this conflict has been considered in 30 meetings, including the one we are holding today. Unfortunately, hostilities continue to intensify, deepening a humanitarian crisis that had already seriously deteriorated after over 4 years of war. This evolution underlines the urgent need to redouble efforts to find a peaceful, sustainable solution. Civilians once again bear a disproportionate burden. They face violence, displacement, and uncertainty, and the possibility of rebuilding their lives are limited. Once again, we've received reports of aggressions against the civilian population that have caused deaths and injuries, and among the dead and the injured are children. Preserving schools and hospitals, ensuring humanitarian access, and promoting accountability are not secondary goals, but rather fundamental obligations. In the same manner, attacks against cultural heritage, such as the one against the Kyiv Lavra Monastery and other cultural sites, do not just destroy symbols of identity and collective remembrance, they are also incompatible with the rules of international law. Panama also condemns the drone attack of the 18th of June against a vessel flying under the Panamanian flag in the Black Sea. A member of the crew died and others were injured. Panama reiterates the importance of ensuring maritime security, including seafarers, as well as the full respect for international law. President, it is indispensable to reaffirm our commitment to comply with the obligations pursuant to the United Nations Charter, as well as full respect of the decisions of this Council that has already taken a position in Resolution 2774 of 2025, urging the parties to put an end to the conflict. An immediate, total, and sustainable ceasefire is urgent to put an end to a conflict that, after almost 5 years of war, continues to cost civilian and military lives. We value the efforts of those who facilitate dialogue and keep open the channels of negotiation. We reiterate our call upon the parties to commit in good faith and to advance towards a peaceful, just, and lasting solution to the conflict. I thank you. I thank the representative of Panama for this statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, I thank SG Khiari and OCHA Director Osorno for their comprehensive briefings. We welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. My delegation remains deeply concerned by the ongoing hostilities and the continued deterioration of both the security and humanitarian conditions in Ukraine. The longer this conflict continues, the longer human suffering is prolonged and the prospects for a sustainable peace are diminished. We are troubled by the continuous escalation of military actions affecting civilian and critical infrastructure. The protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure including schools, hospitals, and homes, are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. We call on the parties to adhere strictly to their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. Madam President, we remain convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the only viable means to bring this crisis to an end. We reiterate that all parties must prioritize the escalation exercise utmost restraint and commit to an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. While we note that diplomatic efforts have reached a standstill, we urge the resumption of international diplomatic initiatives to lay the groundwork for a constructive path to peace. Madam President, a durable and just resolution of this conflict must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and be fully consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and a shared vision of common and sustainable security. To conclude, we reaffirm our unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. The people of Ukraine and all those affected by this conflict deserve peace, prosperity, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank SG Kyiari and Director Osorno for their briefings. The crisis in Ukraine continues to drag on, with the situation on the battlefield intensifying and civilian suffering mounting. This is a development that no party wishes to see. All civilians must be protected, and any attacks against them should be condemned. Recently, the growing hostility between the parties, coupled with an escalating spiral of military confrontation, will only further dim the prospects for peace. This is a highly dangerous trend that must be reversed without delay. First, it's essential to remain calm and exercise restraint and make every effort to de-escalate the situation. Military confrontation offers no solution. It will only deepen divisions, undermine mutual trust, and heighten the risk of further escalation beyond control. We call on the parties concerned to remain calm, exercise restraint, strictly abide by international humanitarian law, and refrain from targeting civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian workers. Efforts to be made to de-escalate the situation and to achieve a ceasefire and an end to hostilities at the earliest opportunity. Second, it's essential to uphold dialogue and negotiation and advance a political settlement. China notes the recent statements by the leaders of the United States, Russia, and Ukraine on peace talks, as well as the existing gaps in their positions. Nonetheless, as long as talks continue, there is hope for peace. The more complex the situation, the more important it is to maintain confidence and step up efforts. We call on all parties concerned to remain engaged, demonstrate political will and flexibility, and properly address each other's legitimate security concerns, with a view to reaching a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement at an early date. Third, it's important to take a long-term view and work towards achieving common security. The crisis has evolved to a stage where the underlying contradictions are highly complex and the interests of all parties are deeply intertwined. We call on all parties concerned to uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security concept, eliminate the root causes of the crisis in full accordance with the principles of the UN Charter, and work towards a balanced, effective, and sustainable regional security architecture so as to ensure lasting peace and stability in Europe. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. Guided by President Xi Jinping's four shoulds, we remain committed to promoting peace talks, advancing a political settlement, and creating conditions for peace. China stands ready to work with the international community and make unremitting efforts towards an early political settlement of the crisis. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to Liberia.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. I thank the briefers for their updates. 6 months into Liberia's tenure on this council, the situation in Ukraine remains not only urgent, but emblematic of a systemic strain on the very foundations of international peace and security. We have met often, and we have heard the briefings. Yet, the violence only deepens. Missile and drone strikes continue to devastate populated areas, killing civilians, especially children on all sides, and pushing civilian casualties to their highest levels in years. Today, as we also just heard, first responders rushing to save lives are themselves being targeted, cultural heritage is being erased, and international humanitarian law is eroding before our eyes. The longer this conflict endures, the greater the risk that these flagrant violations become normalized. This moment, therefore, demands that this Council act with clarity and resolve. Madam President, the figures we have heard variously cited by the briefers are not mere statistics. They are human lives interrupted and futures foreclosed. They are children. Many have been killed or injured. And we know the staggering physical cost it will take to rebuild. But we must also reckon with the children who have known nothing but this war. Beyond the immediate physical toll, an entire generation faces profound psychological, educational, and developmental consequences. Our global response must focus not just on rebuilding shattered infrastructure, important as they are, but on restoring lives and opportunities lost to years of this war. International humanitarian law is clear, Madam President. Civilians and humanitarians must be protected. Civilian infrastructure must never be targeted. and humanitarian access must not be hampered nor weaponized. As OCHA recently reminded this Council yet again in another briefing on Ukraine, civilians need concrete action, not just sympathetic concerns. That message bears repeating today. Expressions of sympathy are no substitute for compliance. The responsibility to protect civilians is an obligation every member state and party to this conflict has assumed, and we are right to expect that they will honor their obligations under international law. Madam President, we must also restate what cannot be said enough. This conflict's consequences cross borders, impacting Africa and the global South through soaring food prices, rising energy costs, and deep economic instability. Furthermore, Liberia is alarmed by reports of contamination by mines and unexploded ordnance, which will paralyze agricultural production and stall economic recovery for decades to come. Madam President, Liberia again joins the call for an immediate ceasefire and de-escalation. We understand this to be consistent with the duty of this Council. And in compliance with that duty, this Council is being urged strongly to actively pursue any avenue to alleviating civilian suffering and creating space for diplomacy. As has often been said in this chamber, there truly is no military solution to this conflict. To conclude, Madam President, resolve deferred is protection denied. We cannot continue to allow the warning we heard, which is that current levels of destruction risk dimming hope for peace, to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The civilians, especially children, exposed to this conflict by no choice of their own, are those bearing its global consequences. They do deserve more than our hollow concerns. They deserve concrete protection and a credible path to peace and a future for themselves. I thank you for your kind attention.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Liberia, very much for your statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Colombia. I thank the Assistant Secretary General, Mr. Khalid Khiari, and the Director of the Crisis Response Division in OCHA, Ms. Idem Wasornu, for their briefings. And I would also like to greet delegations that are present here. Colombia takes note of the most recent reports on the situation on the ground and deeply regrets that while we see a multiplication of calls for peace and de-escalation, the parties continue acting in a way that feed confrontation, worsen human suffering, and diminish the possibilities of finding a political solution for the conflict. The events that we are reviewing today should lead us to a unanimous conclusion. This escalatory dynamic needs to stop. It's been enough. And with regards to this, I would like to say three things. First, we are concerned about the growing human and social cost of the war. Recent reports on damages remind us that conflicts also erode collective memory, the identity of communities, and the social fabric, which will be necessary to rebuild once the war is over. To this, we add attacks reported against residential buildings, supermarkets, and other key infrastructures for the civilian population. We are equally concerned that certain operations could have effects that go beyond the mere moment of the strike and affect the environment and the living conditions in communities for years to come. Air, soil, and water pollution can have lasting consequences for public health, food security, and the recovery of affected territories. Secondly, Colombia notes with alarm the intensification of hostilities and the evolution of military capacities used on the ground. While we see that both parties have increased their capacity to reach targets that are farther away and have a greater impact, we also see growing risks for the civilian population, especially in urban and highly populated areas. War does not suspend the obligations enshrined by international humanitarian law. It makes them even more necessary. The principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution should guide all military operations. We also reiterate our concern over any military activity carried out near nuclear facilities whose possible consequences would be catastrophic for the population and the environment. Third, Colombia considers that the current situation shows, once again, that the solution to this conflict will not be military in nature. Giving peace a real chance demands much more than just statements. It requires an immediate and definitive ceasefire, along with credible mechanisms for monitoring and verification, and specific confidence-building measures, such as the recent humanitarian exchanges between the parties, protection guarantees for the civilian population, as well as rapid, safe, sustained, and unhindered humanitarian access, family reunification, and the full respect for obligations applicable to prisoners of war. It also requires preserving and strengthening spaces for dialogue and mediation. We are concerned about confrontational narratives that continue to harden positions and make it more difficult to reach an understanding. Words can feed war, but they can also help build peace. I thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Security Council. The representative of France has requested the floor for a further statement.
Oui, merci, Madame.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. Following the accusations from the representative of Russia against my country, I wanted to say that it's very revealing that when confronted with the reality of massive strikes on Ukraine, Russia has nothing to say except to refer to World War II, as well as to reiterate absurd allegations being leveled at France and the UK, as well as to accuse others of behaving as it is itself behaving. I'm referring to the cathedral. I'd like to recall that it is Russia which had recourse at the outset to Iranian drones and North Korean soldiers. It was then Russia who, for a year, has turned down the ceasefire everyone is urging it to accept. And it is Russia who, despite months of discussions, is refusing to engage in peace negotiations underpinned by respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. The representative of the United Kingdom has requested the floor for a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. And in support of the remarks of my French colleague, it's striking that rather than engage meaningfully with calls for a ceasefire, Russia has once again revisited its irresponsible and reckless conspiracy theories from 2022. The UN highlighted, the UN High Representative for Disarmament was very clear at the time that the UN had seen no evidence of biological weapons in Ukraine. So let's recall the facts. Russia started this war. Russia can end this war. There are no legitimate excuses for its crimes against Ukraine. And as the G7 leaders said last week, we remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK for the statement. The representative of Russia has requested the floor for a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I heard the statement made by the representative of France. He said that he rejects any allegations that I supposedly leveled at him. Indeed, we do accuse European states of providing weapons support to Ukraine, pumping it full of weapons so that it can continue military hostilities. As far as I understand, you do not deny that? Thank you for your attention.
I thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, let me foremost thank the Colombian presidency for convening this meeting and express my gratitude to the delegation of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukrainians' request. I'm also grateful to the distinguished briefers, ASG Khaled Kyiari and OCHA Director Adam Vosornou for their briefings and evidence of new war crimes committed by Russia against Ukraine and our civilian population, as well as against UNESCO World Heritage Sites. ASG Kyiari has also mentioned that there were alleged casualties among the Russian population, and I must stress that all these data were not verified, thus reportedly is the crucial word in the briefing on this matter. And I call upon the members of the Council to be cautious when Russia keeps inventing stories and figures. And I would also like to briefly react to the statement of OCHA Director Vosornou and some colleagues on this table, the delegation of the Bahrain. I would like to underline that Ukraine and our armed forces respect international humanitarian law. It is a Bible for us. And our troops never, ever attack civilians. We upheld the principle of distinction between the civilian and military objects. And since Russian oil refineries were mentioned today, I would like to say that an oil refinery that produces fuel for Russian tanks, Russian combat aircraft, and missile carriers is not a civilian object in the sense that Russian delegations and some colleagues are trying to impose. It is a legitimate military target, and this is not our interpretation. It is the definition set out directly in international humanitarian law. Article 52, paragraph 2 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions formulates this criterion unambiguously. Military objectives are those which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization offers a definite military advantage. So this definition has two elements: the contribution to military action and the military advantage from the strike. Russia's oil refineries satisfy these both criteria. Madam President, we are aware that it is already the sixth meeting devoted to Russia's war or aggression against Ukraine within the months. And the reason for this intensity of our debates in this hall is very simple. And it is definitely not Ukraine's whim. It is the unprecedented level of Russia's missile terror against Ukrainian civilians that leaves our delegation no choice but to request these emergency meetings of the Security Council. Yet every time we think that Russia has reached the very bottom of its brutality and can sink no lower in its cruelty, Mr. Putin shocks the world again and again by unveiling a new dimension of barbarity against Ukrainian civilians and against our cultural heritage. In the night of June 14 to June 15, the Russian Federation launched one of the largest combined aerial attacks against Ukraine, with 70 missiles and more than 600 drones. And the primary target of this brazen attack was our capital, Kyiv. 5 people were killed and dozens injured, including children and a pregnant woman. Few attacks throughout Russia's war have caused such profound pain, for this strike was aimed at the very heart of Ukraine's cultural and spiritual heritage. Russia has once again crossed yet another red line in its relentless barbarism. Russian armed forces deliberately targeted and damaged the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, an Orthodox monastery erected in the middle of the 11th century, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1990. And it is not only one of the holiest shrines of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, but also one of the greatest spiritual and cultural treasures of all Christendom. As a result of this treacherous attack by Russia, the Dormition Cathedral, originally built in 1078, was hit and sustained heavy destruction. Moreover, Russian forces intentionally destroyed another sacred cultural landmark, the Dovzhenko Film Studio, founded in 1926, our Ukrainian Hollywood and a symbol of a century of Ukraine's cinematic heritage. This cynical strike resulted in the loss of Ukraine's largest and oldest film costume collection. This latest Russian attack also damaged Ukraine's National Palace of Arts and the National Cultural Art Museum Mistetsky Arsenal, as well as the Kyiv National Karpenko-Kary Theater. In Kharkiv, Russia's attack resulted in the killing of 5 and then emergency responders, and one of them died and the 6 in the hospital, in a so-called double tap strike while they were extinguishing fires caused by a previous strike. Many other rescuers were injured. Civilian infrastructure, including cultural institutions like the Kharkiv Art Museum, was severely damaged. In Dnipro, Russian strikes damaged civilian infrastructure, including cultural facilities like the Hall of Organ and Chamber Music, while casualties and destruction were also reported. Other affected regions included Sumy, Zaporizhia, and Kyiv, where residential buildings and infrastructure were devastated. Next day, on June 16, Russia launched attacks involving more than 130 drones against multiple regions in Ukraine. At least 3 civilians were killed and dozens were injured. Next day, June 17, Russia continued its wave of brutal attacks, using more than 100 drones. Civilians were killed and dozens wounded in Sumy, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. On June 18, Russia carried out another large-scale aerial assault against Ukraine, deploying more than 200 attack drones and 7 ballistic missiles. The attacks targeted Kyiv, Dnipro, Poltava, and other regions, killing and injuring civilians and causing further damage to civilian infrastructure. Last Friday and during the weekend, Russia attacked Ukraine with almost 100 drones each single day. In every case, these drones were intentionally directed not at military objectives, but at innocent civilians across Ukraine. On June 20, Russia killed 5 persons in Zaporizhia with a glide bomb. 13 more were injured. This night, 3 civilian merchant vessels en route to Ukrainian ports were struck by Russian drones. This attack caused a fire aboard a vessel flying a flag of Panama, resulting in the death of a crew member, an Egyptian national. Russian forces also attacked vessels flying the flags of Palau and Belize. Such strikes represent a direct threat to the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea and require a resolute response from the Security Council. Madam President, all these systematic and deliberate attacks against Ukraine and our civilian population constitute blatant and grave violations of international humanitarian law. These actions amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity and must be condemned in the strongest possible terms and finally met with a decisive response from the UN Security Council. Madam President, allow me to highlight in a few brief points the truly global significance of this most recent large-scale attack on the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, an outrageous assault that reaches far beyond Ukraine. This monastery is one of the holiest sites of Christianity. During its 1,000-year history, the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra has survived foreign invasions and wars. The Lavra was in the middle of the Mongol Tatar hordes that sacked Kyiv under the command of Khan Batu in the 13th century. It has survived the occupation of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. It has even survived Stalin's religious persecution. And now, in the 21st century, Russia, an impostor permanent member state of this Council, struck at the very heart of this irreplaceable treasure of humankind, deliberately targeting the Dormition Cathedral, the principal church of the monastery complex, with a drone. As a result of this treacherous attack by Russia, the cathedral, inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, sustained significant damage, while the upper part of the Dormition Cathedral suffered the greatest impact from the fire. The threat also extended to the lower sections of the church, putting its historic murals, frescoes, and iconostasis at risk. It is not only one of the holiest shrines of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, but also one of the greatest cultural treasures of the whole Christian world. Madam President, today, on June 22, as we commemorate the 85th sad anniversary of Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, we once again heard from the Russian representative a familiar mix of distortions, myths, and outright lies about the Second World War. But the irony is striking. It was during the retreat of the Red Army from Kyiv in 1941 that the Dormition Cathedral was blown up on orders from the Soviet leadership in Moscow. The blame was then conveniently placed on the Nazi German occupation authorities, and this was the official Soviet narrative that generations of us, me including, were taught in Soviet schools. And today, 85 years later, we are once again hearing new falsehoods and new twisted narratives from Russia about the memory of the Second World War. Today, Russia presents itself as a principal victim of Nazi aggression against the USSR. Yet only a tiny portion of Russia's territory, less than 5%, experienced brutal occupation by the Third Reich. Ukraine, by contrast, became the main battlefield of the war. The whole of Ukraine was engulfed by the fighting, fully devastated, first by the Nazi invasion and then by the brutal battles that accompanied the liberation of our soil from foreign occupation. The Ukrainian people paid an immense and horrific price. Up to 10 million Ukrainians lost their lives during the Second World War. Ukraine's land was subjected to devastation on a scale never seen before in history. Every Ukrainian family carries the memory of that tragedy. And that is why neither Russia nor anyone else has the right to monopolize the memory of the war, to appropriate the suffering of its victims, or to weaponize, as we see today in this hall, history for political purposes of Moscow. Madam President, this reprehensive Russian strike against the Dormition Cathedral was not only a stab in the back of Ukrainians, it was a slap in the face of the entire civilized world. Just imagine if Westminster Abbey in the United Kingdom had been deliberately struck by a drone. Imagine if Notre Dame de Paris had been targeted in an act of precision destruction. Imagine if St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, America's parish church, had been scared. Imagine if the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, one of the most sacred places not only for the Chinese people, but for all humanity, had been hit in the same way. Imagine if the Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark, the Riga Cathedral in Latvia, or the Parthenon and Meteora monasteries in Greece had been damaged this way. Imagine if the Badshani Mosque in Lahore, in Pakistan, one of the greatest monuments of Islamic civilization, had been attacked. Imagine if the Basilica of Santa Maria d'Antigua in Panama, if the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary of Chiquinquirá in Colombia, the Cathedral Notre Dame du Congo in Kinshasa, the Sacred Heart Cathedral in Monrovia, or the Fakhr ad-Din Mosque in Mogadishu, in Somalia, had been reduced to ruins this way. Madam President, by authorizing this deliberate drone attack of the Pechersk Lavra, Mr. Putin has secured his place among the darkest figures of modern history. His name will forever be associated not only with the destruction of cities and the killing of civilians, but also with the targeting of humanity's cultural heritage. These crimes will be remembered for generations, even long after this war has ended and justice has been served. Driven by these imperial delusions, Mr. Putin has long sought to appropriate the historic legacy of Kyiv and Rus, one of the most powerful medieval states in Europe, centered in Kyiv, as well as such sacred landmarks as the Dormition Cathedral, in an attempt to anchor Russia's statehood and spiritual identity in Kyiv's history. Yet by deliberately damaging the cathedral, Mr. Putin has struck at the very foundations of this false narrative that Russia claims to inherit. He has driven a nail into the coffin of his own historic myth, the illusion of any legitimate connection to the spiritual heart of Ukraine's orthodoxy. Madam President, during this fateful night of June 15, Russia, as I already mentioned, intentionally damaged another iconic cultural landmark, the Dovzhenko Film Studio, founded in 1926. It is our Hollywood and a symbol of a century of Ukrainian cinematic heritage. The Dovzhenko Film Studio, established during the same golden age of filmmaking in the 1920s as the major film studios like Warner Brothers or Walt Disney Company or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, is one of the oldest film studios on the European continent. For nearly 100 years, it has served as a cornerstone of Ukraine's cultural life, producing more than 1,000 films, many of which received international acclaim, won prestigious awards, and became enduring classics of world cinema. This brazen Russian missile strike resulted in the destruction of Ukraine's largest and oldest film costume collection, representing an irreplaceable part of the nation's cultural memory. This goes far beyond physical damage. It is an attack on Ukraine's identity, artistic heritage, and the legacy of generations of filmmakers whose work has enriched global culture. Madam President, imagine the world's reaction if a ballistic missile strike were to destroy the historic collections of Pathé Film in France, Nordics Film in Denmark, Universal Pictures in the US, Ealing Studios in the UK, Riga Film Studio in Latvia, or Finos Film in Greece. Imagine if a century of cinematic heritage preserved through wars, political upheavals, and generations of artists, were suddenly reduced to ashes. The outrage would be immediate. Governments would condemn it. Yet this is precisely what Russia has done in Ukraine. The Russian missile just struck the Dozhenko film studio, and it did not simply destroy a unique collection. It obliterated irreplaceable artifacts that embodied 100 years of Ukrainian cinema and national identity. Imagine if in a single moment the costumes and artifacts of global cinema, from Star Wars and Indiana Jones to iconic legacy of James Bond, were destroyed in a deliberate strike. From cinematic traditions of China, Changchun and Shanghai film studios, and famous Pakistan's Lahore studios, to Colombia's vibrant audiovisual industry and the film heritage of Liberia, the world's cultural treasures are not confined to Hollywood and Europe. Imagine if, in the blink of an eye, the costumes worn by Chinese cinema icon Zhang Zi or by Pakistan's Lollywood star Shan Shahid were irreversibly destroyed as a result of a deliberate strike. Buildings can be restored and infrastructure can be rebuilt, by cultural artifacts are different. Once destroyed, they are gone forever. They are lost for humanity for all time. And that is exactly what happened in Kyiv. On June 15, as the Dozhenko film studio was reduced to ashes, Russia must be punished for this act of barbarism. Madam President, before I conclude, I cannot help but turn the attention of the Council to the recent report of the Secretary General on children and armed conflict. Russia has been blacklisted for 4 consecutive years as a UN member state whose armed forces systematically commit war crimes against Ukrainian children, including killing, maiming, and the destruction of schools and hospitals. Since 2023, the number of children killed and maimed by Russian forces has increased by 78%. Attacks on schools and hospitals attributed to the Russian army have nearly doubled. Incidents of denial of humanitarian access have increased by more than 800%. The Russian armed forces have secured a place on the Secretary General's list of shame for grave violations against children in armed conflict, alongside terrorist organizations such as ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Hamas, entities widely recognized among the most barbaric in human history. So Russia belongs to the exclusive club of murderers of children and perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. May I ask you, distinguished members of the Council, whether you feel comfortable sitting at the same table with a member state whose armed forces are responsible for verified, widespread and systematic war crimes against children, as well as crimes of sexual violence? I do not. It makes me shudder with disgust. Russian military and security personnel shall be banned from UN peacekeeping operations. Madam President, over the past months, Ukraine has fundamentally changed the dynamics of Russia's war. Even Russian military bloggers are openly admitting that Moscow cannot win it. The boomerang of war unleashed by Mr. Putin has returned to Russian territory, and for the first time, Russians are feeling the dark breath of this war. Almost 40% of Russia's oil refineries have been damaged and no longer support its military campaign. Recent days have shown that even the air defense shield built around Moscow, reinforced by all the systems pulled from across Russia, is failing to protect its military targets. And that is just the beginning. Over the past 15 months, Ukraine has repeatedly called on the Security Council to adopt a resolution for a full and unconditional ceasefire. Unfortunately, Ukraine's outstretched hand has remained hanging in the air. Ukraine stands ready to engage in direct negotiations with Russia to secure a just and lasting peace in accordance with the UN Charter. But our patience is not endless. If the Security Council would further choose a wait-and-see approach, I cannot exclude that Ukraine may recalibrate and modify its offer. Ceasefire along the de facto front line is already a great compromise. So addressing the Russian representative, I can give you one advice: you will never be able to hold the occupied lands. Never. So get out of Ukraine as quickly as possible before it is too late, I think.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has requested the floor for a further statement. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My response won't take up too much time, especially given that we listened to a lot of information about the cultural heritage of Ukraine, the Russian Federation, and that of many countries all over the world, the majority. But I did want to repeat two things I said in my statement regarding the Kiev-Pechersk-Lavra monastery complex. The very same people, that is the Ukrainian authorities, have been deliberately dismantling the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical church. We spoke of this at various events, including ARIA formula meetings. Monks are being evicted from the Lavra. They're being beaten. They're not letting them go and visit the places where they used to serve, the places they used to live. This is very important, and we cannot forget about this, because this is one of the reasons why there is division in Ukrainian society. It's one of the reasons behind the current crisis. As for the Druzhenko studio, Security Council members, I invite you to look at the photographs. They're available in the media. There you can see that UAVs were manufactured there. They were assembled there. All of this information are publicly available. The Druzhenko studios, well, we do regret what's happened there. One of my favorite films about the war was filmed there. Only Old Men Go to War. Leonid Bykov, I'm sure colleagues know this actor. He played the leading role in that film. Recently, I saw a report in the media which said that a bust in honor of this actor in Kramatorsk was vandalized and was then taken down. A huge number of monuments to writers and other cultural figures are being taken down in Ukraine. These are artists which are not to Kiev's liking at the moment for political reasons. And that's not the only thing that's happening. Books are being banned. Ukrainian writers' books. Ukrainian authors who wrote in Russian, their books are being banned. And the use of the Russian language itself is being prohibited. This situation must be taken into consideration by Security Council members. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement. I would now like to give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Colombia for convening this meeting and the briefers for their comprehensive presentations. Madam President, we strongly condemn the massive Russian drone and missile attacks targeting residential areas and civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. As indicated in the recent report by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Russian escalation has resulted in the highest number of civilians killed and injured since April 2022. Russia is carrying on the sustained campaign that brings devastation to communities across already exhausted by years of war and widespread destruction. Madam President, as a member of the World Heritage Committee, Poland also strongly condemns the strikes that have severely damaged historic and symbolic sites, including, as we heard, Kyiv's Pechersk-Lavra. This is yet another alarm bell for the whole world that this war crosses all norms, and Russia is striking universal values and heritage. An attack on the site of the World Heritage List is an attack on the civilized world, as we all decided that these sites belong to us all, and that should be condemned by the international community. By striking Pechersk-Lavra, A leading center of Eastern Christianity, Russia further undermines the narrative it has long promoted about its role as a guardian of orthodoxy and a defender of the so-called faith enemies or the rotten West. The reality contradicts these claims in the most stark and painful way. We see a deeply troubling pattern in Russia's behavior. If something cannot be captured, it is destroyed. Madam President, these actions demonstrate that Russia is not pursuing peace. Rather, it continues to advance imperial ambitions. Russia is trying to fulfill these aims with its armed forces listed for grave violations in the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflicts, and as well as in the report on conflict-related sexual violence. We are speaking here about a permanent member of this Council. We therefore reaffirm our position that the international community must maintain and strengthen its support for Ukraine's defensive capabilities while simultaneously increasing pressure on Russia. We call on Russia to immediately cease hostilities, agree to an unconditional ceasefire, and engage in meaningful negotiations aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace. Time for a ceasefire is now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Morocco, and San Marino align themselves with the statement. And I thank the Colombian presidency for convening this meeting and also thank the briefers for their updates. Colleagues, as we speak, Russia's illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine is entering 1,579 days. The UN has verified that it has caused a staggering number of over 62,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine since February 2022, in open violation of Russia's obligations under international humanitarian law. What the Kremlin thought would take just a few days, namely invade its neighbor against the very principles of the UN Charter and subvert Ukraine to its authority, has now lasted longer than the First World War. That is some shocking statistic for a mere special military operation, isn't it? For all the destruction it has caused, Russia has not achieved its goals on the battlefield, and instead, its war today is causing an estimated 1,000 deaths and injuries a day to invading Russian soldiers themselves. But Russia doesn't seem to care. When every other member of this Security Council has called for an immediate ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities, Russia instead intensifies its attacks. Just in May, Russia launched a record 8,150 long-range drones and 211 missiles against Ukraine. It doesn't care. Since the start of its invasion, according to independent verification by UN agencies, Russia has damaged or destroyed over 1,600 schools, 3,000 healthcare facilities, and 600 churches. Last week, as you've heard, a Russian drone hit the historic Kyiv Pechezk Lavra, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is considered one of the world's most significant sites for Orthodox Christians. International humanitarian law forbids Russia from attacking schools, healthcare facilities, and cultural sites, but it doesn't care. For the fourth year in a row, the UN Secretary General has blacklisted Russia's armed forces for committing grave violations against children. After impartial investigations by the United Nations, the Secretary General has now also listed Russia for conflict-related sexual violence. It doesn't care. Behind all these damning facts and numbers are mothers, fathers, children, human lives, and futures lost or destroyed. But rather than change its behavior and cease its violation, Russia doubles down on its war and even plays the victim, and questions Ukraine's inherent right to defend itself by striking Russia's military. Russia doesn't care. So if Russia doesn't care, there's no alternative than ensuring that it stops, at least it stops, including through the power of diplomatic persuasion exerted by the members of this Council. Colleagues, Russia must end its war of aggression, and it must engage in serious peace negotiations without delay. We need a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire and a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. We all, collectively, need to work together to achieve this goal. Ukraine wants it, Russia must too. At our last meeting in this chamber, 14 Council members called for a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities. All but one, because we care. The international community cares. Enough is enough. Time for a ceasefire is now. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lambrinidis, for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias. President, we thank the Colombian presidency for convening this meeting following Russia's latest wave of deliberate and indiscriminate attacks against civilians in Ukraine on 14th and 15th of June. The Baltic states align with a statement just delivered by the European Union, but we would like to add the following. This Council is meeting even more frequently in response to the increasing intensity of Russia's desperate and barbaric attacks against the civilian population of Ukraine. As Ukraine continues to weaken Russia's war machine through deep strike operations, the Kremlin has responded by escalating its attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. These are acts of desperation. These are acts of desperation. The large-scale combined aerial attack on 14th and 15th of June was again clearly directed at Ukraine's civilian population and infrastructure in densely populated areas, including the UNESCO World Heritage Site Kyiv Lavra. At least 11 civilians were killed across the country and dozens were injured. Targeting one of Ukraine's most important cultural and religious sites is yet another example of Russia's attempt to erase Ukraine's identity and cultural heritage. This is part of broader escalation. According to UN data, civilian casualties have reached their highest levels since the early weeks of the full-scale invasion, driven largely by Russia's intensified use of powerful weapons against densely populated urban areas far from the front line. These attacks were not against military targets. They hit cities, homes, infrastructure, and places of worship. Colleagues, nearly 20,500 Ukrainian children are estimated to have been unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred to Russia by the occupation powers. This vile act of systematic deportation, forced transfer, indoctrination, Russification, and militarization of Ukrainian children amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity. In addition to repeated listing in the Secretary General's Children and Armed Conflict report, Russia's crimes have also been documented in the Secretary General's report on conflict-related sexual violence. The investigators have verified 310 cases committed by Russian forces against Ukrainians, including rape and gun rape, genital mutilation, and applying electric shocks to genitals. It must lead to perpetrators being held accountable and to further concrete action. We recall Security Council Resolution 2242 from 2015, which welcomed the Secretary General's decision to prohibit repeatedly listed countries from participating in United Nations peacekeeping operations. Russia must additionally be listed on the basis of systematic and widespread abduction and deportation of Ukrainian children. Russia presents itself as a party seeking peace, but its actions show the opposite. Russia repeatedly returns to the narrative that the Istanbul negotiations were undermined by others, yet avoids the obvious question. Had Russia not invaded Ukraine, there would have been no need for the Istanbul talks, nor for negotiations to end the war started by Russia itself. This war was unjustified from the outset and constitutes a grave violation of the UN Charter and the fundamental principles of international law. President, the Baltic states urge all UN member states to finally take a firm stance on Russia's aggression against Ukraine. A strong and united response is needed to reinforce respect for the UN Charter and ensure accountability for violations of international law. Russia needs to be collectively forced to ceasefire and then to just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Enough is enough. A ceasefire cannot wait. There is no other way around this. There is no way around this. We call on all UN member states to join us in seeking justice for all victims of Russia's aggression and accountability for all those responsible. We urge all states to support the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine, in line with the Council of Europe's 15th May resolution. The tribunal should become operational without delay and send a clear message that aggression has legal consequences. The International Criminal Court arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova for the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children stand as a clear precedent. Accountability at the highest level is both possible and necessary. The warrants must be implemented. Let me use this opportunity to reaffirm, finally, our unwavering support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We will not waver until justice and peace are achieved. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for the statement. The representative of Ukraine has requested the floor for a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Just a very short reaction. I would like to reject and discard this flow of lies that we have just heard from the Russian representative, trying to justify the war of aggression. Not a single word that we heard corresponds to the truth. It seems that even the Russian representative herself does not believe in all the lies that she had to spread in this council. We just heard a fairy tale that everything in Russia is just perfect and wonderful and beautiful, the economy is flourishing, the armed forces are heroically advancing, and the military operation is conducted according to a plan. However, the reality on the ground is exactly the opposite. Since half a year, Russian troops have stuck along the front line. Russia is losing over 30,000 soldiers every single month, double as many as the Soviet Union has lost during the 10 years war against Afghanistan. The Russian population started panicking because suddenly the consequences of this war that Mr. Putin has unleashed are reaching Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities. So it reminds us a famous French song, «Tout va très bien, Madame la Marquise». А в остальном прекрасная маркиза.
And the rest is fine, absolutely fine.
That this message, even if you proclaim it 1,000 times here at the Council, will be comforting to the Russian population, starting to see the ugly face of war. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.